Okay, welcome to this webinar of the Jerusalem Press Club, which is part of a series we are running towards the coming presidential elections in the US. We are privileged to host today Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer, who served as the US Ambassador to Egypt from 1998 to 2001 under President Clinton, and Ambassador to Israel from 2001 until 2005 under President George W. Bush. He holds a PhD from Columbia and presently is the S. Daniel Abram Professor of Middle East Policy Studies at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. Ambassador Kurtzer, thanks for joining us today. First of all, would you dare assessing or guessing or betting who will win on November 3rd?
You know, after 2016, we are all very humble in that regard. The polls 4 years ago showed a clear pathway to victory for Hillary Clinton, and of course we know what happened. The polls today are showing a larger margin of support for Biden than Clinton enjoyed in 2016. So there's a little bit more of a sense that perhaps Biden will prevail, but I'm very skeptical of polling because I think there's a large number of people in this very large country who either don't respond to polls or who don't tell pollsters the truth for a variety of reasons. So I'm nervous about trying to predict.
Okay, fair enough. How would you characterize the US-Israeli relations during the Trump term? Was he really the greatest friend of Israel, as he is sometimes described, or was it more rhetoric than substance?
Well, for sure, Trump has been the greatest friend of Prime Minister Netanyahu and the government of Israel over these past 3+ years, almost 4 years, because the Trump administration has responded to almost all of Prime Minister Netanyahu's priorities and has fulfilled many of the Prime Minister's greatest wishes, moving the American embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing Israel's claim to sovereignty in the Golan Heights, being very tough on Palestinians, clamping down on some of the behaviors that the Prime Minister has opposed. And now in the last couple of months, being able to take advantage of openings with the Emirates, Bahrain, and now Sudan. So there's no question that the relations between the administration and the current government in Israel are better than anyone would have imagined. But, you know, until there's a serious focus on Israel's most significant security issue, which remains the Palestinian question, one would have to raise questions about the Trump administration's policies. And I think second, given what the Trump administration has done vis-a-vis Iran, which is to end the US involvement in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action without replacing it with anything, which has allowed Iran to restart many of the programs that it had stopped as a result of the JCPOA, these policies actually have hurt Israel in a way that could not have been anticipated.
So we'll talk about the Palestinians and Iran in a second. But in the meantime, whatever happened to the Trump's deal of the century? It seems like it faded away.
Well, as it should have. I will not hide my own view that it is one of the least mature ideas in a library of ideas for resolving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It's very long, 181 pages, but the authors of that proposal clearly learned nothing from the lessons they might have learned with regard to Israeli and Palestinian aspirations, narratives, what a map actually might look like in the context of a final settlement. Everything about that plan was so faulty that it was fated to fail the moment it was unveiled. And now no one talks about it. Sure, if Trump wins a second term, The administration will try to revive it, but it may be beyond revival, and we may have to start over again, even if Trump wins a second term.
But how about the argument that so many presidents, secretaries of state, special envoys, ambassadors like yourself tried the well-conceived and advised plans and nothing happened? Comes Donald Trump and thinks out of the box and tries something which never has been discussed. And some people claim he made some progress.
Well, first of all, I take issue with the idea that nothing happened in previous efforts. Between Madrid and Oslo, the various agreements that in fact were reached, the security cooperation between Israel and Palestinians, the negotiations between the two sides that in fact have narrowed the gaps substantially. If you look at where the two sides were in the 90s and where things left off when John Kerry's efforts did not succeed in 2014, the gaps have narrowed substantially. And so we are all prone to want to see immediate progress all the time. But in the course of a protracted conflict, like between Israel and the Palestinians, that's been going on for well over 100 years, in the past 25 years, substantial progress was in fact made and still can be made. Part of what I've tried to do since coming to Princeton University in the books I have written, some of which are over my left shoulder for those who are interested in reading the titles.
They are on sale on Amazon, no?
They're on sale on Amazon. And if you buy one, the numbers will go up dramatically. So what I've tried to do is to draw out the lessons learned. And there are a few critical lessons that should be learned by not only the parties, but by the US administration that I think have still failed to be learned. For the United States, the most important is the question of how dedicated an administration is to doing the hard work of bringing these two parties together. If you want to be an honest broker, you have to be an honest broker, which means to deal with the asymmetries of power and the asymmetries that exist between Israel and the Palestinians. And the US, basically ever since James Baker back in the Madrid days, has not done a very good job in trying to balance those asymmetries so as to provide a context in which negotiations might succeed.
Talking about being honest broker, your colleague Aaron Miller called the United States Israel's lawyer, which meant the American administration were bending over too far. And you yourself, in an op-ed in the New York Times, I think back in 2016, criticized the decision of President Trump to select David Friedman as U.S. ambassador to Israel. Will the Biden administration, if he's elected, will try to resume a more balanced position?
I believe it will, but with a very large caveat. President Biden will face an enormous number of high priority problems when he walks into the Oval Office. Domestically, dealing with COVID and the economy and health and immigration and race relations. Internationally, dealing with Russia, China, Iran, that this issue, the Israel-Palestine issue, will have to vie for his attention. And we may find ourselves in a situation where it gets relegated to somewhat lower priority. But that doesn't mean that things can't be done. Certainly a Biden administration can undo some of the problematic policies and activities that were undertaken by the Trump administration. For example, I don't think the US Embassy will move out of Jerusalem, but the administration can put Jerusalem back on the table where it always has been by saying that it recognizes that Palestinians will have a capital in East Jerusalem once they have a state. And then it's going to be a subject of negotiations. We can reopen our dialogue with the PLO by opening up their office in Washington that Trump closed, or by reopening a consulate to allow for better communications. We can find ways to restore assistance both to the Palestinian Authority and to the United Nations agency that deals with Palestinian refugees. So in other words, there's a number of things that a Biden administration can do without unveiling a major initiative, but which signifies a return to more normal American diplomacy and support for a two-state outcome.
What you call being an honest broker is sometimes viewed by some American Jewish organizations as anti-Israeli. You yourself didn't become a darling of some of them, didn't you?
Well, having worked for administrations that in fact raised questions about Israeli policies, such as settlements in the occupied territories, some of us did come under significant criticism for that. But, the fact is that every administration for which I worked and every administration since then has been absolutely committed to Israel's security, safety, and well-being. Some have done more, some have done a little bit less. Trump administration has done things that the Netanyahu government really likes. The Obama administration did many things that the Netanyahu government liked, including that 10-year commitment for very substantial American security assistance, as well as the emergency assistance that was provided for the Iron Dome and other anti-missile systems. So in the context of US-Israeli relations, the United States has been a constant partner for decades. Some administrations, though, have been a little bit tougher on some Israeli policies with which we disagree. And the most, I think, significant of them is the settlements issue. Just last week, an announcement was made of 5,000 more units. Just yesterday or today, an announcement was made that the U.S. will now fund projects in the West Bank and Golan. These are issues which have not been traditional American policy, and which may be subject to change in a different administration.
The conventional wisdom was that once the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is resolved, the rest of the Arab countries won't have problem in reconciling with Israel. But the Abraham Accords seem to have contradicted it. What is your take on that?
Well, my view is a pox on both theories. In other words, the idea that Arab normalization depended upon a solution to the Palestinian issue was as wrong as the idea that the solution to the Palestinian issue depended on Arab normalization. The fact is that they are in some ways connected, but in many ways not connected at all. The Arab Peace Initiative back in 2002, and which still formally is on the table, did signify a connection that the Arab Summit said that there would be full peace and recognition once the Palestinian issue was resolved. But we've now seen that that may have been an overstatement. First of all, neither the Arabs nor Israel did enough to test the proposition that was included in the Arab Peace Initiative. And second of all, countries like the Emirates and Bahrain, which have never really been in a state of war with Israel, they don't share a common border, they've never sent any of their military into combat with Israel, have decided that their own interests will predominate. But one can expect that they won't forget the Palestinian issue, even if it's not the most important question on their agenda.
The Palestinians were quick to condemn the Abraham Accords, saying this is another show of betrayal by fellow Arabs. What is your reaction to this? And also, a few weeks ago, we hosted here Saib Erekat, leading Palestinian negotiator and politician, who was very vocal in his opposition to what he labeled another show of betrayal. He now, unfortunately, is in a critical position in Hadassah Hospital. Wishing full recovery. Do you know him? Do you have any recollection of him?
Well, I've known Saib since before Madrid and have maintained a very a very close relationship over these many years. And of course, I'm praying for his full recovery. He's in a challenging position, having had a lung transplant just a short while ago. And you know, he's representative of a number of Palestinians who take a very tough line towards Israel, but who remain committed to nonviolence, who remain committed to a two-state solution, who remain committed to the idea that Israel and Palestine can live side by side in peace and security. So, you know, both Israel and Palestine face off against tough negotiators. And those are the people that really should be respected. And we hope that they do well. With regard to the Palestinian reaction to the normalization between the Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Israel, I have said publicly that I think it's been overstated, and that Palestinians, even if they are upset at having not been involved in coordinating that move, still have agency. In other words, they still have the ability to put forward their own ideas and to advance their own propositions and their own positions. And simply arguing against the actions of other states without offering an alternative view is not really serious policy. So one can hope that once this period of an emotional response has passed, that Palestinians will do the hard work of developing a policy and a strategy, and then trying to market it diplomatically, of course, with Israel, but also in the international community. And they have not yet done that. They've really kept their responses to this kind of negative portrayal without offering any positive alternatives.
So if Biden is elected, how can the administration jumpstart the failed Israeli-Palestinian peace process? Maybe by taking a fresh look at the Arab Peace Initiative or a regional summit, or maybe taking advantage of the fact that now the Emirates and others are joining to welcome or coerce the Palestinians into joining?
Well, your use of the word jumpstart conjures up an image of a car whose battery has failed, and it's not so simple to get it running again. You've got to provide some juice to that battery, and you've got to get it ready to run smoothly. Frankly, I don't think that even a very willing Biden administration will be able to move quickly to get to negotiations, and I don't think it should move quickly. There's a lot of preparatory work that needs to be done. First of all, the issues I mentioned earlier, reopening channels of communication and putting Jerusalem back on the table, dealing with Palestinian assistance. Those are things that will feed some juice into the battery of this peace process. Second of all, there are some changes in American policy which need to be made. Number one is to ensure that people understand in a Biden administration that the Trump so-called peace plan is not relevant any longer. And therefore, the administration would have to recommit to a two-state solution that takes into account the security requirements of Israel and the territorial and governance requirements of the Palestinians. So there's a lot of preparatory work that needs to get done. A lot of it may not be flashy. In other words, there may not be a big conference or a special envoy. You may not see all of the trappings of a major U.S. initiative, but a lot of hard work can get done to get that motor running again, so that in some period of time, a year or two or whatever, you can jumpstart a serious peace process with the two sides believing that there may be a possibility of progress.
It seems that Prime Minister Netanyahu, surely with the help of current Israeli ambassador in Washington, Ron Dermer, put all the eggs in the basket of Donald Trump. What happens if Joe Biden is elected? How will it affect the U.S.-Israeli relation? And you served under a Democratic president, a Republican one, so you're the best person to answer that.
Well, I think the problem is larger than just putting all their eggs into President Trump's basket. They seem to have put all their eggs into the Republican Party's basket, because you remember the support that was given quite openly to the candidacy of Mitt Romney just a few years ago against an incumbent American president, Barack Obama. So I think a lot of repair work will have to get done because there certainly are scars that are existing on this relationship right now. Scars never seem to go away, but you can live with them provided you take care of the actual scar tissue and invigorate the body. So I think the immediate responsibility will be on the Israeli government to show a Biden administration that it is willing to work productively and seriously with the Democratic Party. My guess is that Biden will be quite open to that. He has already talked about building bridges between Democrats and Republicans anyway. So I don't think he will try to widen the partisan divide, but rather to narrow it. But I think that Israel will have to demonstrate that it is not committed only to the Republican Party. And if it's able to do that, then as I mentioned earlier, the very strong relations between our two countries can progress even further and deeper.
One of the main goals of Netanyahu was to scuttle the Iran deal brokered by President Obama. And once Donald Trump was elected, Netanyahu was has actually achieved that goal to his line. However, in doing so, he alienated many Democrats, especially with his appearance in the Congress, defying President Obama's policy. If Biden is elected, do you think he and the Democrats will hold a grudge toward Netanyahu or just forget about it?
Well, it's hard to forget about it. It's part of what I call that scar tissue, but I don't think they're going to focus on it. First of all, my guess is that Ambassador Dermer's tenure will at some point come to an end. He's been in Washington a long time, and a new ambassador will be able to establish a fresh start. But more importantly will be U.S. Israeli and U.S. Arab coordination on the question of what we do about Iran. The debate being, do you go right back into or try to go right back into the JCPOA with no changes, or do you try to negotiate a different JCPOA that has some reference to Iran's missile developments, its support for terrorism, its malign activities in the Middle East? And I don't know how that debate's going to turn out. I think there's a strong argument to be made to try to get back into that agreement as soon as possible so as to stop Iranian nuclear developments in their tracks. We've seen in the last months the possibility that there's new covert activity underway to build nuclear facilities. Enrichment is proceeding in a way that had stopped under the JCPOA. And so I think the Biden administration, even with some memory of some of these actions that it didn't particularly like politically, will at least set them aside and focus more on the substance of how do we stop Iran's program, and how can we do that in a way in which we're working together better with Israel and the Arabs than we might have worked in the past.
We were talking about attitudes towards Israel in the White House and in the Congress, but what about the public? Well, it seems that the support of Israel has become a partisan issue. And does it worry you, the population at large, and more so in the American Jewish community, where according to a recent AJC poll, 3 out of every 4 people vote for a Democratic candidate?
Well, I'm a natural worrier, so the answer is even if the problem was not large, I would be concerned. But I think there is a problem, and it may not be that significant yet, but it's one that we have to pay attention to. Number one, there is a progressive wing within the Democrat Party. It's not that large. It's very loud. We hear from members of the progressive wing all the time. So it seems to be larger than it really is, but there is a progressive wing that wants to see what they call a more balanced American policy. In other words, one that is more critical of the things that Israel does in the occupied territories and less critical of Palestinian performance. And so that has to be, I think, assessed carefully. I wouldn't go overboard in believing that the Democratic Party has shifted. It has not. The mainstream of the party, as we saw in the platform that was formulated before the Democratic Convention, the mainstream of the party remains seriously committed to Israel and to its security. In the broader society, there are some changes which need to be watched as well, but again, I wouldn't exaggerate them. One of the places that we look to is college campuses, where some college students, university students, have become more vocal in criticism of Israel. And they've tended in some ways to mix their concerns about Palestinians with the race relations issue in the United States in a formula called intersectionality, where you kind of merge these two issues together. It of course makes no sense. The origins and challenges of these issues are so different. One is a particularly American context and the other is a Middle Eastern context. But that has some resonance on university campuses. And therefore, there is an effort to at least push back, if not offer a more traditional view of Israel as a reliable ally, with which we sometimes don't agree, but which most of the time we find common interest and common cause.
Talking about the campuses, I just want to mention that we at the Jerusalem Press Club for the last 6 years have been hosting groups of journalism students from the graduate journalism schools, with their faculty. And as you mentioned, sometimes we encountered some kind of hostility or animosity which had nothing to do with Israel or with the Middle East, but they brought from America. But we found out that when they left, they had a different perspective of Israel. You're the author of several books on the peace process, like Negotiating Arab-Israeli Peace, American Leadership in the Middle East. You co-authored the Peace Puzzle, America's Quest for Arab-Israeli Peace, etc. And 3 years ago, you wrote an opinion article in Haaretz titled, America Can't Save the Two-State Solution. What do you think about it? What have the last 3 years done to your assessment that maybe the window of opportunity for that has been closed?
Well, if I might, Uri, just one last word about college campuses. We tried something at Princeton where a Palestinian American professor and I created a forum called Conversations About Peace. And our objective was to bring together the campus groups that are most interested in this, both within the Jewish community and the Palestinian community and the larger university community. And by and large, it's been very successful. I'm not sure we've changed anybody's mind, but everybody talks to each other civilly. And we're able to bring speakers, even with divergent views, and to have the people representing these organizations on campus actually engage. So I'm a big believer in dialogue, even in a university situation where people tend to go to opposite corners and stop listening. With regard to my own attitude, views, perspective on where things are, I have not yet given up on the two-state solution, if only because there is no real alternative if we're looking for an end to the conflict. My graduate students at Princeton looked at this question a few years ago in a project called Alternatives to the Two-State Solution. And they looked at about 15 alternatives and discovered that there really aren't any that might be acceptable to both sides. So if we really want to end this conflict, it's going to have to end in partition so that both Israelis and Palestinians can achieve their national self-determination and their national rights in at least part of the homeland that they consider to be their own. My concern is the problematic policies and actions of both sides until we get there that seem to be heading towards a one-state solution, creeping annexation on the part of Israel, extending recognition to outposts that were illegal even under Israeli law, allowing settler activity to continue unabated, including some really horrible activities such as burning down olive groves and so forth. And on the Palestinian side, the continuation of support for those who are engaged in violence and terrorism, the fact that incitement against Israel has not really disappeared from their discourse. And so both sides need to do significant soul searching. It's easy for me to say. I live in Washington, D.C., and I'm 6,000 miles away, and I know how difficult it is to be living in the midst of this conflict. Having lived in Israel twice as a U.S. representative, once as ambassador, once earlier in my career. I was a student in Israel in 1969. And so I know what it's like to be living in that pressure cooker where the day-to-day issues of security and well-being and, can my kids go off to school safely and return safely and so forth are so important. But unless both sides stop doing the bad things that are leading to a one-state possibility, which neither side wants, we're going to be in trouble. And so we really need leadership to get us back on the track towards realizing a two-state outcome.
You used the term partition before, and it occurred to me that I once read the original Peel Committee Commission of Inquiry into the Partitioning of Palestine, 1937, and the closing sentence is, this plan doesn't give each side all what it wants, but it gives each side what it wants most. I think this is a clever phrasing. We have a question from Professor Alfred Muller, who quotes Professor Elliot Cohen in Foreign Affairs magazine today that says that American influence in the world will decline if Trump is re-elected. Do you subscribe to this?
Well, first of all, Elliot Cohen is a very good friend and extremely smart. And so anything he writes or says, we should pay attention to it. In this case, I do agree with him. In the large question of American influence in the world, the Trump administration has done an exceedingly poor job. Trump has tended to favor relations with the worst dictators and the worst leaders out there, Kim Jong-un, Vladimir Putin, other leaders who have done some very seriously bad things in their own societies. And he's tended to alienate American allies who have been the mainstay and foundation of American security since the end of World War II. Trump has never had good things to say about our allies in Europe, and the transatlantic relationship is perhaps the most critical of our security relationships. Trump pulled out of the nascent Trans-Pacific Partnership as soon as he came into office, which, even though it had some faults, would have created at least the beginning of a Trans-Pacific Partnership as we've had in the Atlantic. Trump has had negative things to say about countries in our own hemisphere, Mexico and countries in South America. And we remember the terrible language he used in dealing with some countries in Africa. So you look around the world, and what Trump has done is essentially divorced the United States from our allies and friends and embraced the people that we can only call our enemies. And so I think what Elliot Cohen is saying is exactly right, that 4 more years of this will intensify the degree to which we alienate allies, we lose the value of the security alliances, and we find ourselves in a world which, Thomas Hobbes characterized as a jungle, and that's not going to be healthy for anybody.
We're going to wrap up, but this week we commemorate the 25th anniversary of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. You served in the American Embassy in Tel Aviv between 82 and 86, I believe, when he was defense minister under Prime Minister Shamir. Then you were involved in the follow-up of the Oslo Accords. You surely have some recollections of him. Can you share them with us?
Well, I'm not the only one who says that he was a great leader for Israel, because he embodied, I think, two attributes that define greatness. Number one, he was absolutely committed to the security of the state and the security of the people, and demonstrated that through the decades of his service in the Israeli army. We remember that he really wanted to be a water engineer before he entered the army, and in a sense gave up his ambition in order to serve the state. And he also embodied the other tremendous attribute, which was the idea that the best guarantee of Israel's security is peace. I remember a speech he gave in 91, I think it was, just before the election in 92, in which he was really quite prescient in saying that the true security challenge for Israel lies across the horizon, meaning Iran. And therefore, Israel has to resolve its immediate security challenge, i.e., with the Palestinians and its immediate neighbors, in order to be able to deal effectively with the larger challenge of Iran. And so you take these two attributes of leadership, doggedly determined to protect Israel's security, but equally determined to make peace, and you begin to understand what greatness really means. On the one hand, you can have great soldiers. On the other hand, you can have those who are great, or at least aspiring peacemakers. But when you bring those two attributes together, you really find yourself in the presence of greatness. And we have missed that for the past 25 years.
Ambassador Kurtzer, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us. I'd like to thank my colleagues at JPC, Talia Decker and Rachel Exil, for facilitating this webinar. Thank you all for being with us today. Stay tuned to our next events, and above all, stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Uri.